Nyawaskano. Again, Swagwigi. Again, greetings to all of you. And what we do now is look at the year of 2020. It's been a long time. And this pandemic that we speak of, Mother Earth's pandemic, has been traveling across this Turtle Island for quite some time. And we all feel it. We all understand this pandemic is not just a virus that affects our wellness. It's a virus that's incorporated in U.S. law. It's incorporated in the livelihood of ranchers, oil well drillers, fossil fuel corporations. It's a pandemic against Mother Earth, fueled by the original instructions carried by the sailors from overseas who brought with them the doctrine of discovery, and the report back to their homelands that they found land that was terra nullius. It was empty because it had no Christians. Well, we're still here to inform the world that the land was never terra nullius, and it's still occupied by the original inhabitants, the humans. The peoples of this continent are still alive, but not as well as we were at one time because of this pandemic. This pandemic to exploit Mother Earth. Our responsibilities to Mother Earth go back to our teachings of the Canandaigua, the Great Law of Peace, which we talk about quite often in our teachings, and we pass it on generation to generation. As we talk about this, we talk about peace and contentment and thanksgiving to our youngsters. And as we've traveled about in the forest here at Onondaga and throughout Haudenosaunee territories, this message can be heard at any village you go to. And also a reminder of the newcomers that came to our land. We have an agreement with them as we notice them going to be staying here longer than an overnight visit when they landed, as they were lost at sea. They stayed long, and we shared with them the bounties of Mother Earth and explained to them how to live in the forest. We shared with them the great law of peace. And as the newcomers start expanding their populations throughout our lands, we noticed that they were going to stay, so we have to have some sort of an agreement. And as we know, the language barriers that we talk about are strong and hard to understand each other, but we did come up with an agreement in 1613. In 1613, when we met them, we came up with this agreement called Gaswenta, Dignity o Hahage, the two paths. Gaswenta, it's known by the Row Wampum Treaty, the first treaty made, and it was a trade agreement with the Dutch people who were landed in our forest. And so what this represents is two rows of peoples. One row represents a canoe, and the indigenous people of our forest living in their ways and their culture, their language, their song, their dance is in one canoe, represented by one row. And the other row is the boat. And those are the newcomers to this land. And in that boat is their ways and their cultures, their religions, their songs, their dances. And these two peoples agreed to live side by side, traveling the river of life, not to interfere with each other's ways, but to respect them. To respect them in understanding of the Canandaigua. and treating everything that Mother Earth provides for us, along with human beings, respectfully and with gratitude. And so as we had this agreement with them, as they were making their trade and sending their findings, their skins and so forth, medicines and foods and trees back to their country, the more people were coming, and the more people were coming. Now this is in 1613 and on. And so in this time frame that we have as far as this panel discussion and this webinar that we're going to, we don't have the time to explain the details of all the events, but we do have time to explain some of the main parts of it, which are treaty and wampum. They understood after they saw our belts of wampum and listened to our laws of the peace here in Haudenosaunee territory, the great law of peace. We shared with them the Thanksgiving address that you hear at the beginning of any gathering, whether it's large or small. We shared with them the governance, the three-bodied governance of our council at Grand Council. And so as you travel about and you're dealing with one nation, whether it's the Mohawk Nation, the Oneida Nation, Onondaga, Cayuga, or Seneca, and later the Tuscarora Nation, which we're known now as the Six Nations Confederacy. And so when you're dealing with each individual fire, that's their matters, what happens within their area of home, of the Haudenosaunee. And so that's their matters to contend with in their council, in their nation. If anything happens to affect a nation nearby, other peoples nearby, another nation, that becomes all of our issue. And we summon a Grand Council, which we still do today. We send runners out, and then we acknowledge to them of what the matters are to be discussed through Grand Council, which involves all of us. And so this had happened, and so we did come up with an agreement in 1613. And so now skipping through for another 100 years or so, this is now the newcomers are becoming comfortable and building their establishments and their houses of worship, and they start arguing amongst themselves of how they're going to conduct their governance once they found that this land is free. All people are equal. All voices are heard. That's when it comes together for a decision to be made. It's by the leaders of listening to the people. And so there was a treaty made that bound us for as long as the grass shall grow green, for as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and for as long as the water flows downhill, that this treaty will be in effect, and we agreed to that. This is the foundation of treaty making with the newcomers and the indigenous people of this Turtle Island. The foundation of it. And so as the people start growing in populations, they start watching how we conduct ourselves as a government. And they even were quoted by some people, and it's written in the archive somewhere in Albany, that they want to know how 5 savage nations can live so far apart from each other, yet be governed under one government. They have to know how we do it. So they asked, and we shared with them. We shared with them how to govern people. And it goes back to the fires, the original fires. Your fire, your nation's fire, all have a fire. And we shared with them the great law of peace. We shared with them what the Peacemaker's message to us was about unity. And one of the main concepts of that is, if you take one arrow, it can easily be broken. But if you take one arrow from each fire, from each nation, and you bundle it together and you bind it with the sinew of the leader of the four-leggeds, and you bind it tight with all the laws and protocols and procedures and ceremony and dance and song that's bound into the Gainesat Gona, the great law of peace, you bind them arrows together, no man can break them. Is what the Peacemaker's message to us was on unity. And so we accepted that message. But he also warned us that that bundle can be unwound by yourselves. So be careful how you conduct yourself. And in that explanation about being careful was the responsibilities that he reminded us of, the gratitude that we show our mother the earth. And also we shared with these new people who were struggling and couldn't get along because of their different religions and places of worship and how to conduct themselves. They couldn't understand the concept of free to roam about in land, free land. The land don't belong to you. The land is not for sale. They didn't understand that. They had their own ways of thinking, but they couldn't govern themselves very well. And they asked for the advice of the Haudenosaunee. And so we shared with them our advice. And so as this time goes on now, you're looking at somewheres in the 1700s now, and the government there, they're battling each other. Their brothers and sisters are fighting their fathers and aunts from what you call British and American. They're all the same people. They're the same families. They start drawing lines in the woods. And we couldn't understand that, drawing those lines. We couldn't understand that. And so, as the battles were going on, and there other people, French people and Swede people, they were looking at all this beautiful land and claiming it under the doctrine of discovery. And we couldn't understand that either, how to claim land. And so, as the time goes on, the wars amongst themselves were going on who has right to steal this land. We're in the middle of it. The Haudenosaunee is right in the middle of all of these battles that you hear about in American history. And so they had wars going on with other nations a little bit west of here. Ohio Valley, they were looking at taking over some of that land, and they were having a hard time fighting. They were getting beat. And they were worried and afraid that if we joined forces with our Western brothers, that they would never have a chance. And so they summoned a treaty. They summoned a peace treaty amongst us. And we gathered at Canandaigua. And when we gathered there, by now there's already a president of the United States. There's newly formed United States going on. And so the president of the United States, the very first president of the United States, George Washington, summoned a peace treaty. And he commissioned Colonel Pickering to go through with this peace treaty, this mission of peace. And so as the discussions went on, they went on for quite some time, throughout the summer and into the fall. The weather's changing. The food had to be brought in abundance, so the hunters were out gathering. And as we met in Canandaigua, the United States, newly formed United States, promised us with their word of treaty that we would have our lands that's known as New York State, and into Pennsylvania and Canada, we would have our lands forever, undisturbed. And so that caught our attention. And so if we don't fight against them in the Ohio Valley area, that this treaty, if this is agreed upon, that they promised that this land would be ours forever. So we listened and we talked and we negotiated and we came up with an agreement. And in this agreement, a little bit more of the history of America before they were called America, the United States government. They were sometimes referenced as the 13 colonies, Continental Congress. And prior to that, what you don't see in the history books is also what they're called. They call themselves the 13 Councils of Fire, after listening to our Canandaigua and how governance works. Democracy. The democracy of the Haudenosaunee was shared with the newcomers of these colonies that were growing on the east. And so they took with them their concept of a council fire. And they called themselves the 13 Councils of Fire. And also you'll see somewheres in the history, you'll see it today behind the judges, behind the President of the United States, who we have a name for, Canandaigua, Town Destroyer. We give that name to George Washington because of his attempts and his action to destroy our villages in 1779. His tactics didn't work to get rid of us as his plan, so it forced him into negotiating a peace treaty with us. 1779, when he was long before president, he was a general. Washington sent troops throughout our home and destroyed our crops, destroyed our villages. And time went on and we healed and we didn't get wiped out like his plan. Because we know our woods, we know where to go to in our house. And so we survived some of the initial attacks, and going on into 1780s, 5 years later, there's a treaty of Fort Stanwix. Fort Stanwix of 1784. That one also promised to leave our lands in the hands of the indigenous people, which is us, the Haudenosaunee. And the wars broke out. It brings us up 10 years later to 1794, the Canandaigua Treaty. And we agreed to them, to their terms, and we had our own terms in there too, of hunting, gathering, fishing, traveling about, roaming freely in our lands, undisturbed, and they agreed to that. This belt that you see right here is the original belt commissioned by President George Washington. The Treaty of Canandaigua, which the actual treaty in written form is in the museum at the Smithsonian, and it's one of the only treaties signed by George Washington, if not the only one. But this belt here is the original since 1794, November 11, 1794. Now we've had this belt in our possession for quite some time, and it was somehow removed from our possession, and New York State obtained it and held it for 100 years or so. And we got it back from them because it's ours. And what this treaty does is it explains the unity of not fighting against the United States, in the promise that we would have our lands undisturbed forever, following the two rows foundation of treaty making, also following the Canandaigua on respect and living in contentment here in our home. And so we agreed to that. But shortly after that, in 1795, and late December of 1794 is being violated, and our leaders put together a letter through the help of some Quaker people who helped write the English, and they also helped interpret the treaties as it was being made from English to our language that we can understand. And also in this treaty that you see here, one of the promises that was made was they were going to supply cloth. And to this day, this is the cloth we receive from Washington D.C. under treaty obligations. And there's been a time in history that the United States wanted to purchase this treaty from us and eliminate it from the books. And our people, of course, refused it. And they said, no, we have a treaty with your people. And also, they offered citizenship for us to become United States citizens so we can be protected by the United States at any time. And we refused it, respectfully sent them a letter to the president in 1924. Thank you, but no thank you. We'll maintain who we are. At that time, our understanding of treaty with another government, the United States, was that if we become citizens of the United States, how can we have a treaty with ourselves? So we maintain who we are, and we maintained and refused the purchase of our treaties. And so as we go on, we also acknowledge that the founding fathers of America, how it's portrayed as founding fathers, developed their Constitution to the United States. The Constitution of the United States of America is this one right here, the Canandaigua, the Great Law of Peace. This one here is considered to be the first draft of the Constitution. After they heard how we govern ourselves and how do we conduct ourselves, political form and ceremonial form in our ways, that they took that and shared it with their people, along with the 13 councils of fire. And so they also took what you see in judges, behind judges, and near the American flag, near the President of the United States to this day, is the symbolism. So back in the colony days, they were so happy. They were so happy that there was abundance of food. And so this abundance of food was Thanksgiving time, the turkey. And because the turkey was so plentiful and it fed them very well, they honored the turkey. And they honored it in a way that that was their national symbol as the 13 councils of fires, the 13 colonies were growing. And then they heard the Great Law of Peace, and they changed their national symbol to the eagle, because the eagle sits on top of the great tree of peace. And so they also took the concept of the arrow, the one arrow, and the 5 arrows bound together. And they took 13 arrows and bound them together. And that's what they put in the grasp of the eagle that you see today. But they also had to understand, to their own people, they had to have something of their origin in their symbol, their national symbol. So it's our understanding that the other talons of the eagle is holding a symbol of peace, which is the olive leaf, olive branch. So they have the unity of the Haudenosaunee, and they have the eagle of the land that watches over our home. And they borrowed these symbols, and they still use them today. And so when they wrote up their Constitution, in their Constitution, there's an article in there that states that treaties are the supreme law of the land, and that all judges and all jurisdictions of their newly formed governance have to abide by the supreme law of the land. And that's another reason that we won't sell this treaty to the United States when they asked. They asked in 1956, they asked again in the 70s, they asked sometime prior to that too, to buy it outright, to just eliminate it. And our elders had said then, as they say today, this treaty's not for sale, nor is our land for sale, and as long as this cloth comes from Washington as promised in the treaty, it shows that it's still valid and as strong as it was the day it was signed, and that we would not accept payment to buy it outright. And also, our elders had always told us that even if this cloth, because this cloth used to come to us in calico and in good design and warm material, and they switched it up some time back. Not certain of the year of the switch, but they changed it to this Muslim cloth, this fine cloth, like sheet cloth. But our elders always told us, even if it gets down to a size of a postage stamp, and we accept that, that treaty is still valid and alive. So what you're looking at here on this one, it's an actual Wampum Belt Treaty commissioned by George Washington. He hired some women of the Oneida Nation here, of the Haudenosaunee, to string it together. And it's locking arms of all their states, the 13 states. And it shows the White House, the Capitol, Washington, D.C., the Capitol, and it also shows that there's two houses here. And the two houses represent that the Long House, which is us, and the White House will be arm in arm, and that we won't fight. It's the peace treaty that Colonel Pickering was commissioned to negotiate with the Haudenosaunee in 1794, which is still going on today. And so when we talk about treaty and honoring treaties, in this treaty and in this understanding of living in the woods, in our forest, in our home, and with this agreement, the foundation, the two-row, we still, as Haudenosaunee people, have not broken this treaty. Although it's been violated a few times by the United States, the Haudenosaunee have kept their side of the agreement. And we plan to continue it that way, because that was what our ancestors, our leaders before us, had agreed on. And so this belt represents this treaty of Canandaigua. Sometimes it's referred to as the Washington Treaty, George Washington Treaty, the Pickering Treaty, or Canandaigua Treaty. However you look at it, treaties are the supreme law of the land. And our people are holding up our end of the treaties, and we're not going anywhere. And this land is not for sale.